Okay, everybody, welcome. I'm sure folks are going to be coming in, but we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today. I want to welcome Chris Corrigan, an amazing host and human being who I've had the good pleasure of getting to work with, and a steward in the art of hosting conversations that matter. Art of hosting conversations and harvesting conversations that matter. And Chris has agreed to be here today with us to talk about the chaotic stepping stones. Maybe there's a little Cynefin framework in there, and I'm sure he'll throw in a dash of something else. So thank you so much, Chris, for being here. And maybe if you want to also just add some additions to your introduction. I'm looking at your website right now, and just there's such vast amounts of knowledge and writing and information on hosting that you've got to check out his website. I'll put the link in here as well. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I don't want to say too much more about myself, but yeah, please do go and visit my website. I'm kind of the lineage that most of the stuff that I know how to do, I've been gifted. So I just return it. So it's all out there. There's a huge garden of work there. I have a blog with several thousand posts that is kind of like, I call it my open source learning space. So it's full of typos and misspelled things and bad photographs and all kinds of stuff, because it's just my jot pad. And then there's also a ton of resources there for facilitation and participatory learning and leadership. And so go and make yourself at home. And if you use anything there, just leave me a little note and say hi. That's how it all works. It's kind of like, I was there. So Dana invited me to come and do this work and work with you guys around this model of the chaotic stepping stones, which is on the face of it, a very strange thing to call a planning tool. So I'm going to explain a little bit what that means, and then I'm going to take you through the tool and we'll do a bit of a dive into it. But what I want to invite you to do first, before we get started, is if you have access to the chat box, I would love for you to take a moment and just reflect around this hour and a half we're going to spend together learning about the chaotic stepping stones. And I'm curious to know what questions you're carrying into this call with you. Why did you make time to be on the call today? And what questions are you carrying with you? What questions are you hoping to engage with? So if we can take a moment just in silence and just type in the chat box what that is. Cool, thank you. And Catherine and, oh, there you are. Okay, Catherine, oh, great. Okay, thank you for those. So if you can mute or we can mute you as we're going, that would be helpful to me. And thank you, Catherine, having to leave in an hour, you said. Okay, I don't think we'll see where we get to in an hour. All right, so here's where we start. I've got a little slide presentation that I'm going to share with you all. So take the last look at my little face for a bit, and then I'm going to take the last look at the face, and then we're going to go here, and we're going to share this. Cool. Everybody see that okay? Yes, yes. So what we are looking at here is the chaotic stepping stones. And this is kind of, this is a tool that I use when I don't know what I'm doing and I don't know where I'm going. That's basically how I describe the use of the chaotic stepping stones. So it's a tool that I can use for a lot of different things. It's like my Swiss Army knife. And on my website is a 9-page guide to using this tool, which goes into some of the detail I'm going to go into here. You're going to get a little bit more than that today, and it's also available in English and Spanish. So if you want to download the Spanish version, it was translated by Colombians, and that's available as well. So the chaotic stepping stones is, you can see that there are 9 pieces to it, clustered into these 3 categories. And it's the kind of thing that we can use both linearly, in a linear way, so we can start at the beginning and go through to the end, and then we can also use it in a kind of non-linear way. Most of my work as a consultant starts with folks that call me up and go, we're stuck, we don't know what we're doing, and it's usually because they're confronting some level of complexity, so it's very difficult to make sense of the world that they're working in, and it's also very difficult for them to be able to see what the direction is that they're going in, and they also know that they need to work with people together. They need to bring more people together than just the folks they've been working with. And so this tool is like a container that helps me to be able to listen to their story and to ask them some questions, and for us to kind of organize some thinking that helps us to make a good choice about the kinds of structure and the kinds of action that we engage in. And I'm going to explain to you what chaotic means in a second, but before I do, I want you to, well, actually, I think I'm going to go do that now. So the chaotic path here, this is the word chaotic comes from this mashup between chaos and order. And I was showing you this diagram. The nature of the kinds of problems that we face, especially in areas like public health, is complex. And so complexity is defined by a number of different characteristics, but one of them is that outcomes in a complex system are emergent. They seem to be happening and bubbling up all of the time. We don't know what's going to come next, so complex systems are unpredictable. And a complex system like a public health, like a community, is basically unknowable. In other words, you can't map everything in the system. You can't know everything. It's like that great Stephen Wright joke, the comedian Stephen Wright, who's the master of one-liners, who said at one point, I bought a 1-to-1 scale map of my city. And there's a kind of funny absurdity to that, which is like the only way you can really know a city is if you have a 1-to-1 scale map. And so anything we do to map complexity is going to be a reduction of that. We're not going to get to know all of the information in a system, but we can either let that paralyze us, or we can begin to work in a way with what we know that helps us to see what the emergent pathway forward is. And in areas like public health, the problems that are being faced in public health are also emergent. So whether it's disease outbreaks or effects of social determinants of health, social determinants of health are by their very nature also emergent. So in other words, there is not somebody with a strategic plan planning on poverty in a particular neighborhood or organizing a food desert in a particular neighborhood. It's the result of a number of factors and things coming together that create an emergent phenomenon of a food desert, or an emergent phenomenon of poverty or racism or exclusion, marginalization. All of these are emergent properties of a set of practices that we call, let's call capitalism in North America, that have that as they come together create communities that have stuff and communities that don't, create uneven patterns of distribution around health and public health and social, and the social determinants of those health, of those things. And in that sense, working in complexity is completely mind-boggling, because because there's actually no root cause. Like, the root cause of one thing is an effect from something else. So another feature of complexity is that things are interdependent and interrelated. And so if you change one thing in the system, everything else changes in the system. And that's both a blessing and a curse in that it's impossible to control the outcome of a system, but you can skillfully begin to work on patterns in the system. And in public health, for example, the social determinants of health are sort of indicators of key patterns in systems, that if we lean on these, or we do some projects around these, or we try and shift these values, or try and shift services that support these things, that we tend to get better outcomes of health. But you can't say that that's true everywhere, and so best practices don't work also. There's just so much chaos. And so that's the nature of complexity. And so in this model, this particular model of complexity that we're looking at here, the chaotic path, is one that's especially suited to Northern California because this emerged from Northern California. This is the work of a guy called D. Hawk. And D. Hawk lived in Northern California, and he was a banker with the Bank of America in the 1960s. And he was given the job of creating a new currency. And I don't know, you guys live in Northern California. I've been there several times. People in Northern California love to create new currencies. But D. Hawk's job of creating a new currency was related to credit cards. So back in the early 60s and mid 60s, if you wanted a credit card, you had to have a credit card that was from your bank and accepted by this merchant. And so you carried around a wallet that was like super thick, full of 1 million different credit cards and 1 million different rules for using them, and so on and so forth. And so the banks decided they wanted to create a new one. It's called the Visa card. And D. Hawk was the project lead involved in that. And he realized that in order to create essentially a new currency, you had to kind of work with a living system. And he didn't have a lot of theory. There wasn't a lot of good complexity theory or organizational theory out and about there in the 1960s. So he did what any self-respecting Northern Californian banker does, and he went to the forest and he looked at the way living systems work. And living systems, life itself on this planet, is a constant dance between chaos and order. We have the messiness of life that precipitates into patterns that then breaks up again and becomes chaotic again, and then more order establishes. And that's basically the pathway of evolution, and possibly revolution as well, but definitely evolution. Is this mix between a form lasts for a while, then breaks down, and then a new form arises. So human beings are part of that, obviously, and so on a sort of fundamental biological level, we're actually good with this dance between chaos and order that D. Hawk called the chaotic path. But our brains, especially those of us who live in Western societies and who have been trained in the Western education system, where rationality is king, and king is the right word, will recognize that the struggle against the natural world has been to control all of the chaos and try and get things into a way in which we can manage what we're doing. And so the temptation to move to control is always present. So as you walk, the kind of leadership that I teach and the kind of leadership that's required to work in complexity is what we might call chaotic confidence. So it's the ability to be in a space where you're bringing a little bit of form to something, but chaos is also bubbling up. That's where innovation comes from. So in the social space, we don't ever create new things from what we already know. We create new things by having what we know challenged and having our former paradigms of order fall away so that new things can come in. But if we have too much new thing come in and we totally destroy the order we've had before, we end up on this other side, this left-hand side of this model, which is called chamos. And chamos is a Greek word that comes into this model from, it's not D. Hawk's. When we started using this model in the art of hosting community, a friend of ours, Maria Scordialou, who is from Greece, looked at this model and said, there's something worse than chaos. And as Greeks, we have a word for that. And the word is chamos, which means the pit of despair. And the pit of despair is the place of which you can't recover. It's the Katrina, it's the disastrous, chaotic, unresolved spot that, we get into with revolutions and epidemics and destitute poverty and lots of other places, and collapse, social order collapse, as well as physical collapse, like from disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, that kind of thing. Chamos is not where we want to go either. Neither is to control. If a system tips towards chamos and control, what tends to happen is people become apathetic. The space of actual engagement is this chaotic path. So this is the other reason why we try and develop this leadership practice of walking the chaotic path, of knowing when to bring just enough form that people and communities can have conversations that matter to them, but not so much form that we control what they're saying, and not so little form that they just show up in a room with nothing to do. The place of engagement is in this mix of chaos and order, and that's walking on the chaotic path. And so we've used the chaotic path and chaotic design as a way of giving you, as a leader or a facilitator or a project host, a project initiator, a place where you can put your feet when you're walking on the chaotic path. And those little steps, those stepping stones, are these chaotic stepping stones. So that's the reason why we call it chaotic stepping stones, because it helps you to walk on the chaotic path. These 9 stepping stones bring a little bit of order to the kind of work that we're doing, the innovative work that we're doing, or new work that we're doing, and allows us to oops, sorry. Allows us to know where we are at any one given time. So I'm going to stop just there for a second, and I'm going to ask you if you have any questions before I move on. Is this clear so far? Okay. Sounds good so far. Okay. All right, so let's have a look and see what these look like and what they really mean and what they're all about here. So the first set of chaotic stepping stones, and I have to say too that part of the evolution of this particular model comes from the fact that I'm a facilitator. So a lot of the work that I do is organizing conferences, organizing meetings, running group processes. And so some of the language here that you'll see is related to hosting in that sense, but it also translates very well into creating new initiatives, because strategic initiatives over time, big community engagement events, participatory public health projects are just like big meetings that last over time. So you'll see that the initial set of stepping stones is called inviting. And the reason why we do this, I'm just going to back up one more here. You'll see the structure way over here on the right-hand side, the stepping stone of structure. One of the ways in which the chaotic stepping stones becomes very effective working with groups of people is that it disrupts our need to want to structure everything right up front without knowing why we're doing something or what direction we're moving into. I often get calls as a facilitator. I got a call actually just yesterday from a group that says, we have a strategic planning, we have a need to do a strategic planning process for our organization. We have a policy, they actually have a board policy about what a strategic plan should look like, and they have an agenda for the day. And they want me to come and facilitate the agenda. And that's fine, but my response to that kind of invitation is usually, you're moving a bit too fast for me. How do I know that this structure and all the choices you've made actually meets the needs that are out there? So we have a kind of a bias in our culture to rush towards having things structured and figured out before we get to work. And what the chaotic stepping stones does is it slows down that process. It allows for us to explore more deeply what's at the core of our work, so that when we create structure, the structure is serving the need. So we begin with inviting, and there's 4 stepping stones around inviting. There's the need, the purpose, the principles, and the people. Every time I sit and work with folks, I have my very first question is, why do you need to do this work? What is another way of asking that question is, what is the urgent necessity that compels you to act right now? Right? You've been happy in the world so far, like everything's been going on so far, and all of a sudden out of the blue, you decide we need to do something. That's what I need to know by need. This isn't about people's needs or getting people's needs met. It's not that kind of need. It's the need in the system that has created the urgency for this initiative or this meeting or this planning process to take place. And that need can be articulated in lots of different ways. But it's about really understanding the current state. For large-scale initiatives, I like to spend some time working in community to understand what that need is, and you can use all kinds of different research and evaluation tools, like Dana was sharing with me earlier, tools like photo voice, statistics, research, story gathering. All of those can help you to begin to understand the need in the community and how people share that need together. I'll say another thing too, is that lots of people from time to time, I run into like entrepreneurs who see this need in the world that nobody else shares with them. And the kind of curse of being an entrepreneur is that you are often a visionary to the extent that you can see something nobody else can see. But if you're going to do participatory work, the challenge there is that if you can't find people who share the need, it's very difficult to invite people into the process. So the purpose of articulating a shared need is so that people can see what it is in their community or in their organization that they need to confront. And they understand that if they're being invited into something, that this is the opportunity they have of affecting it. For a number of years in the early 2000s, I was involved in a large-scale transformative process that was working in child and family services in British Columbia, where I live. And what we were doing was creating governance authorities so that Indigenous communities could take complete charge of the child and family services system, everything up to lawmaking authority. The only thing they wouldn't be able to do is create laws, but they could write laws which could be passed by the provincial legislature. Everything else would be under their control. Resourcing, the kinds of models of social work, of family support, of guardianship, all of those kinds of things were on the table, and they were all, the Indigenous communities were invited to create governance bodies that would oversee those systems. And there was a very compelling need for that. And that need was expressed this way. In 1962, the province of British Columbia took over responsibility for child and family services from the federal government for Indigenous people. And in 1962, the percentage of children in care who were Indigenous was about 3%, which is pretty good. The population of Indigenous folks in BC is 5% of the population. So 3% kids in care, okay, that's above average. That's better than average stat. In 2002, when we finally met to discuss this initiative, the percentage of Indigenous kids in care was 51%. So it had risen over that whole time period, 40 years or so, from 3% to 51%. And the province at that point, I mean, First Nations communities, Indigenous communities had been saying for years, this isn't working. And when it hit that 51% number, for some reason, at that point, the province said, you know what, we don't know what we're doing. And so we need to create new governance structures. And that need was super powerful. Everybody could see that need, and that number became the compelling invitation to our work. So your first piece of work when you're doing chaotic design is to get a really strong sense of what your need is. Why are we doing this? What is the urgent necessity? What do we all see? What do we all agree upon? For large-scale initiatives like the one we were engaged in, you can spend years. We spent a couple of years trying to understand the need in more detail. We got that 51% piece, but then we ended up going around Vancouver Island, which is where I was working. We were creating a regional authority for the 51 First Nations of Vancouver Island. And we did a number of open space meetings in longhouses where communities came together to talk about the problems they were facing and also to talk about what a child welfare system would look like that everybody wanted to be a part of, which is a community. And so how do we actually take the dynamics of really well-functioning communities and build a child welfare system using that? It's kind of like a version of biomimicry. Instead of mimicking natural systems, we're mimicking healthy community systems. So getting the need was very powerful, but in that process of getting the need, we also got the purpose too. And our purpose was a very important statement that arose after a conversation in a circle with a number of parents. And one of the parents said, I asked the question, we were asking about healthy community, and I asked the question, what happens when a child dies in a community? Because one of the reasons why we needed to create a new system was because a child had died, an Indigenous child had died in the care of the system, and there were 14 inquiries that were taken to put the system back together. And this parent said, when that child died in 2002, nobody took responsibility, and that's why we had to have all these inquiries. No one took responsibility for that child's death. And so the provincial government set all these inquiries and investigations into motion to bring the system back together. But she said, but a child died in our community last year, and when that child died, everybody ran to the center. They all looked after the family. They all looked after the siblings of the kid who died. They looked after the kid's friends so that they wouldn't be prone to suicide ideation and other patterns that affect Indigenous communities often when people die in tragic ways. And we did the cultural protocols, and within 3 days, like, we had a potlatch going and families came from all around the territories to participate and so on. And so she said, when a child dies in a community, everything comes to the center. And that became our purpose. Our purpose was to create a system in which we put children at the center, and children at the center became, the 51% was the need statement, and children at the center was our purpose. We're moving from a system where 51% of kids in care are Indigenous to a system where we create a new child welfare system with children at the center. That was a super powerful purpose that was there. And I'm just seeing your chat, as I'm just trying to find your chat as we go here, Sue, so I got that. The clarity of purpose, how do we get there? So, so there's lots of different ways that you can create purpose. That's a large scale piece. That just kind of resonated with folks. It was a very powerful move. And as we began to use that purpose, that was something that people could get behind. And the thing about children at the center for a massive public initiative was that it was a generative purpose as well. So it wasn't that we knew where we were going. All right, so the point of creating a purpose in a complex system is not to say, here's the end state, we're going to eliminate poverty. That would not be fair to say to folks that you're going to eliminate poverty. What I would say is that the purpose statement of children at the center was powerful because what it allowed us to do was to sit down with people and talk about what that meant. So I do remember one person who works in youth justice and is a mental health counselor inside prisons. Youth prisons or youth detention facilities. And he said to me, he asked me this great question. He said, okay, I get that you are putting children at the center, but how does that work in terms of mental health for youth in prisons? And I said, that's a great question. Let's talk about it. And he was like, well, you mean you don't have the answer? It's like, no, we don't have the answer. We're engaged in this work of trying to do this stuff. So, so need and purpose work together really critically to create a generative form of engagement for us to be able to work on. Catherine's asked a question about, if there's a new concept that addresses a need that not all have identified, then the work becomes getting everyone to identify the core need. Yes, the idea is if you try and do work without people seeing why it's necessary to do work, you won't engage them in the work. So the need has to be shared, especially for large scale work. But it's also true of like something as simple as a staff meeting in your organization. I mean, how many people ask themselves, why do we need a staff meeting every Monday? What is the purpose of the staff meeting? And are we even conscious about it? Or do we just get together and share things that otherwise could be emailed around to each other? We have a half an hour or 45 minutes together on a Monday morning. Why are we not like bringing tricky questions to that? What is the compelling need that makes it important for me to be there? And if there is a compelling need, then meet. And if there isn't a compelling need, don't meet, don't undertake the work. So need and purpose go together, and that's a key thing. And as you work on strategic initiatives, you're going to be creating what we call here, a core team. I'm going to come back to this in a second, but the core team, you can see right at the center of the core team's work is the purpose. So need and purpose are the kind of thing that a core team is going to be revisiting over time. Also, when you're creating invitation, so that becomes the core of an invitation when you can articulate the need and you can articulate the purpose and people in your system could articulate the need and the purpose, then you can begin to invite people in. You begin to identify like who's important, who matters to us, who are our essential stakeholders. So what I do with a group of people right away, as soon as we've begun to design the work, is we create a core team, which, as I say, I'll get back to you on, and we make a whole list of people who might respond to this need and this purpose, and we put them on. I literally draw these concentric circles on a big wall or a big massive, put it on the floor. And I get people to bring their like contact lists, and we get pile of Post-it notes, and people write like a name and an address of a person who needs to be involved in this. And then we just use these concentric circles to say like, how close are they to the work? Are they somebody who needs to be on the core team, which is like every week they're going to be meeting and talking about this stuff? Are they on the second rim out, which might be essential stakeholders that need to be engaged over, you know, maybe once a month, or get communications from us, or we need special ways of relating to them? Are they on the next line out where we might have a large group assembly and consult them from time to time? Or are they people on the furthest rim out who just need to know of our efforts and need to keep informed? They're not going to be contributing much. What the levels of engagement piece helps you to be able to do when you're naming your people is it helps you to be able to create sort of tailor-made communications and engagement strategies. So you're not trying to include everybody, you're including people at the scale at which they matter to the project and at the scale at which they can contribute. So the people piece, once we have the need and the purpose, the people piece is pretty easy to put together. And I've used this model from everything from planning conferences to, you know, again, doing the large group or large scale systemic work as well. So that's how we then include the people. And then back here, you then have the principles. So naming up front, beginning to name how it is that we'll work together is really important. Naming principles begins the process of designing structure, but we're keeping it at a very high level. So with the child welfare work we did on Vancouver Island, one of the principles we named very clearly on was that community was going to, this would be a community-driven process. So that meant that community was going to be writing policy, that community members would be convening conversations themselves, community members would be doing their work, and we would be taking direction from community. And it meant that we needed to build a governance structure, therefore, that made that an authentic and an honest process. And it also meant we had to build capacity, because folks in community are not used to writing child welfare policy. So we need to build capacity around that. But having that principle of community-led was super important. Having a principle of our ways of working together would be Indigenous and informed by the 3 Indigenous cultures of Vancouver Island meant that it was important for us to have elders on staff who could advise us all the time of what we were doing and not doing, and how we were getting it right or getting it wrong. So the principles, very lightly held, only a few, help you to be able to structure the work and help you to be able to invite people in and be clear about how they can participate. When you have the inviting phase in place, what I like to do is we like to build a core team, especially for larger pieces of work. And the core team is the folks that are right close to the purpose. Their job is to steward the purpose of the work and keep it going over time. And so what that looks like and what that means is you have a team of folks who take on different roles. The roles on this particular diagram of a core team are sort of related to maybe hosting a large-scale meeting or a large series of large-scale meetings, but you can shift and change these as you need to. But let me explain a couple of them because I think some of them are super important. The role of the caller is really important, to have people who are close to the purpose, who see the need and the purpose, for whom everything is invested in this. That's what we call the caller. So that's the person for whom you're all doing the work. And that can be one person, it can be a few people, but it's the person for whom the work matters the most. It could be the one with all the resources, it could be the one with a mandate, it could be your boss, but the caller is the client of the process. The strategic perspective ones, these are folks that may be inside a system, so people with power or people with resources who are not directly involved in the work, but who definitely have a yes or a no, who can, and I mean, I've been involved in several systemic change efforts where the anxiety of the people in power can often crush the whole effort. So getting people with strategic perspective in the loop around the core team is super helpful, even if they're not there all the time. And then the other roles here, logistics, space host, harvester, process host. These are all roles that you might employ if you're doing a large meeting or a conference. Someone to look after the practical details of things, someone who takes care of the physical setups of where we're at and where we're meeting. The harvester could be the people who are capturing key insights, doing evaluation, doing documentation of the work. and the process host would be the facilitator, the people who are choosing, or the team of people that are choosing and working with various methods in order to engage. So having a core team like this is a key piece of the work we're doing, especially on a systemic change initiative. And that takes you through to the end of the invitation set here. So I'm just going to stop there for a second and see if there's any questions around like completing this invitation package. This is always the first step of design that we do. Anyone got anything they would like to ask or, whoops, sorry. Anybody got anything they'd like to ask or get some clarity on?
I think I'm still kind of stuck on the problem statement and all of the work that would go into defining a problem statement that could rally and that everyone agrees on, and maybe all of the work that would go into assessing current state to be able to properly get to the core of the issue. I mean, your example about the burning platform is great. And it's nice when it's obvious like that, but it's not always that obvious.
Yeah, it's never that obvious. Let me say, it's never that obvious. It's the nature of complexity that you will never fully understand what the problem is, right? So the point here is we're not, it's this, and this is a slight sort of disruption from the rational approach that we take to planning, where we need to know what the problem is so that we can solve it. This is not about creating a problem-solving process. This is about creating an engagement process so that we can work over time to be shifting the conditions in the system. So you don't need to know what the problem is per se, because the moment you start working on it, it's going to shift and change, guaranteed. The moment you even begin this process of observing and understanding the current state of things, the system begins to change. So I always encourage people to actually not get so wrapped up in the analysis of the problem, and to I'll simply ask them, like, why did you start this work? Well, because people are suffering in our community. Great. How are they suffering? Like, not great, but like, that's clear. Tell me how they're suffering. People are hungry. People are poor. It's like, all right, that's enough of a need. People can see that around them and go, yes, that is true. What are you telling me you're doing something about that? Then that's what you need to initiate. So it's not doesn't have to be an in-depth articulation of the current state, but what it does need to be is something that's easy to communicate, which explains why the necessity of your, my cursor has disappeared here. Hang on, I'm gonna have to do this. Which explains why the necessity of your initiative. And I think there's an art to being accurate, and there's an art to being accurate without being too lost in articulating the need. What I would say about the chaotic stepping stones also is that these, and we'll see in a sec, but these are iterative. I'm going to go back here. These are iterative. So you're always going to be coming back as you're doing this work and checking in, is the need still present? Is the purpose still present? Does that help a little bit?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. So don't get too stuck here. The idea here is that we start somewhere and we follow in, we go deeper and deeper as we move along. So I'm going to get to the second part of the design piece here, and that is designing the implementation. It's kind of seems like a weird thing to do next. Like, why wouldn't we, now that we know the need and the purpose, why wouldn't we now design how we're going to get to where we're going? But the reason why I stop people even from designing that now is because very often, I mean, how many of you have been facilitators, for example, where you've run a meeting and you've got like 1 million flip charts and you roll them up under your arm and you take them back to your office and you have to try and figure out what to do with them next, right? It's like a common problem amongst facilitators. And to me, that's a design problem. That means that I haven't thought about what I'm going to do with this stuff. I didn't design into the work the implementation phase, and so I'm unclear about what we do next. And it's a problem for those of us who are facilitators, because we love the tool that helps us to have the dialogue. We don't always think about what the follow-up is going to be, or we hire somebody to type up the notes and we make a report. And that is not the best use of what we call harvesting. Is just to write a report and send it out to people. I'm always wanting people to focus on the implementation. And so the implementation comes down to these two kinds of design characteristic or design considerations. The first one for me is outputs. And the second one is the architecture of implementation. So I'll tell you another little story of an organization I worked with a number of years ago, the National Aboriginal Forestry Association. And this was in 2006. We were working, 2006 was significant because 10 years before, we had had a national inquiry in Canada called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And that Royal Commission, in Canada, we, from time to time, initiate these Royal Commissions. They're like society-wide inquiries into different problems in our society and different issues that are facing Canadian society. So this Royal Commission went out and did its work, and it reported in 1996. And it was a very thick report. It was several volumes of a report that was entitled Gathering Strength. And somebody measured that if you put the volumes side by side, they take up about 18 inches of shelf space. And that's where most of the reports ended up, was on a shelf. And people nicknamed the report Gathering Dust, because that's also a feature of Royal Commissions, is we do all this study, but we don't think about the implementation. So 10 years after the Royal Commission reported in 1996, in 2006, the Aboriginal Forestry Association decided to call a conference where it would create implementation plans for the dozen or so recommendations in that report that related to forestry in Indigenous communities. And that was everything from preserving multiple forest uses to labor market and enterprise development for Indigenous forestry operations and so on and so forth. And so my client called me up and she said, we're having this conference, we'd like you to facilitate it. We'd like to do some plenary world cafes with about 200 people. Then we'd like to do breakout sessions where folks are working on different recommendations and they're coming up with implementation plans. I said, that's awesome, that's dynamite. So what are you gonna do with these? And she goes, well, we're producing a report, right? I'm like, okay. And what are you going to do with those? And then people in the sectors can use that report to actually implement I said, so it's the same as what the Royal Commission did. And she paused and she went, yes, right? So I said, well, that's good, because in another 10 years, we can come back and figure out how to implement the implementation reports. And so she said, well, I said to her, what's your architecture of implementation? Which was a word that just came to my mind. And she said, oh, that's a good word. I'm going to go and think about that. So what she did was she went away, and 3 weeks later she came back and she said to me, okay, I have a UN working group that will be meeting in 8 months, and they have agreed to put our implementation plans on the agenda because they're doing work around natural resources and Indigenous communities. I have a parliamentary standing committee that is looking at making resourcing recommendations to 2 or 3 government departments around Indigenous forestry. We have a sector council, which is all the employers and folks involved in the industry of forestry who are looking at increasing Indigenous participation in the labor market, and they're looking for our recommendations. So now we have a conference where we can invite people to come to the conference knowing exactly what it is we're going to be producing and how it's going to be used. And that is why we do implementation planning before we actually decide what the structure is going to be. Because later, the structure will help you to produce these, when you do the design, the structure helps you to produce these outputs. And then knowing what the architecture of implementation is, in other words, building some scaffolding that helps to continue your work after the meeting is over or after the initiative is done, helps you to be able to give life to the work that is being done. So outputs, they fall into 2 categories. There's basically the tangible outputs, the reports, the videos, the summaries, the recommendations, whatever it is we're producing, policies, new services, making a building, tangible things that we can see and hold and objectively recognize as being a result of our work. And then there's the intangible outputs as well. And these include relationship, community, commitment, culture, pride, empowerment. All of these kinds of intangibles are super important to name, because just because we can't see them doesn't mean that we're not producing them. It's entirely possible to produce a kick-ass public health report with recommendations and policy, and as you're doing it, destroy social cohesion in a community by having a series of incredibly crappy community meetings that put people off the participation for any future participation in a process. Maybe some of you have seen that before. When we're making decisions about the structures and the ways of working in community, we have to factor in also the intangible outputs. Are we creating more relationship? Are we leaving more community than we found? Are we creating broad and shared commitment to the work over time? Or are we eroding those things by simply focusing on the key outcome from the work? So this is a way of keeping people conscious about the kinds of structures they're using and the kinds of values and that they're embedding into those structures. So I like to have people articulate those things, because that then goes into a consideration of the structure that we're beginning to design. And then the other thing is like, as long as we're now producing these tangible and intangible things, what are the things that can support the action? So who's got the resources? Who's got the power? What influence do we need? What are people ready to do? What empowers people to be a part of the action? So as we're working in the child welfare system, for example, we're working with parents and grandparents and kids, right? What are they able to do? Are we asking them to do more than they're able to do? Can we help build capacity so that they can, for example, become people who write policy? That's possible. So those are all, setting those in place early on means that we know if we have if we're generating action ideas, we know that we can resource them, right? And I'll come back to ways in which you want to do that. But for me, these are super important design considerations, to think about how we're going to implement what it is that we do beforehand, so that we don't just have a meeting and then walk away with all the flip charts under our arms. So there's two pieces I can dive into a little bit more here. And I'll share the slide deck with you guys so you can play with this a little bit. This is a sort of template that we use when we're doing strategy around implementation for complex projects. So what we do is we put in the center of our work our shared purpose and our shared work, and we ask that, and we continually come back to that. So again, it's what the core team does. What is our shared purpose? What is the shared work that we're doing? What's at the heart of our project? And then we like to kind of inquire around these 3 points of this triangle. So who's got the power and the influence? What do they need in order to support us? How do we include them? And understanding the power and influence we already have. So, you know, I've been involved in initiatives where, you know, we produced art as a result. We produced plays or interpretive dances as a result of the work we're doing. There's nothing wrong with an interpretive dance, but if your job is to get a boardroom full of fundraisers on board, an interpretive dance might not be the best way to do it. So you have to think about, like, who has the power and the influence in the system, and what do they need to see in order that our work is taken seriously by them, and in order for them to be able to use what we're giving them to meet mandates from those that pay them or those that have given them power. So the power and influence analysis is super important to do. On the other corner, this lower left-hand corner, the results. So just asking, like, what action can we take that will prove the worthiness of our work? What metrics matter? What are the ways in which we evaluate our work? What are the ways in which we tell the story of our work? Being able to prove the worthiness of our work will extend the goodwill we have from those that have the power and the resources in our system. So we need to be able to share those with both the folks that are funding us, but also the folks that are giving us social license, the participants, the communities. They need to be able to see that their work matters as well. So the results point of that triangle is super important. And then on the lower right-hand side, the other piece we ask is what capacity needs to be embedded in the system to sustain the work. If we're doing new and innovative work, quite often the work requires us to build capacity so that we can, so that folks can learn new ways of doing things, so that they can understand why we're taking a new approach to things, and so that they can be involved from the ground level and not bringing in experts that might kind of trump the community's intelligence. So how can we build capacity within the community or the organization or the system, and embed learning as an ongoing strategy for innovation? So this is our strategy triangle that we'll use to kind of answer some of these questions. Yeah, and then I think the last thing I'll say about, like, planning implementation is that we often move, when we're working in complexity, one of the things that's really important to do is to start at a small scale, but to move out. And so this is a little piece here that describes how we start in the center by noticing what patterns are happening in the system, and we probe those patterns to see what we can learn. When we get ideas, that's what the light bulb means, we can prototype those ideas. When we have a prototype, we can start attracting money, people, and time. So those are the 3 kinds of resources that will make anything happen. So a prototype is about, oh, let's try a thing and see if it works. If it works, if it doesn't work, we'll try and improve it. When you're doing a probe in a system, you try a thing. If it doesn't work, you abandon it and try something else. It's a low risk, low reward kind of a strategy, but it helps you to try new things to see what's up. And if something's promising, then it goes into a prototype level. At that, when we prototype something for a little while, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prove a concept. We can resource it with a bit of money, with a bit of people attention, and with a bit of time for people. If that works, then what we want to do is we want to pilot it. And pilot projects, can last a year or more. So we can actually, the goal of a pilot project is to actually prove that a concept will work so that we can move it into something that's a program or a policy or a product or a longer term piece of work that has a budget, organization around it, and planning. So as we move into more and more stable forms of action, we learn by going, but we don't start, and what's critical about this is we don't start implementation planning with saying, wow, if we learn something, we'll immediately do a pilot project, because pilot projects can be a massive amount of time and energy and resources, and they rarely return much learning. What we usually get from pilot projects is people who give us data that say that the pilot project works, and so can we fund it again for the next year? What we really want to do is we really want to build into implementation planning the ability to fail quickly. So a lot of the work, probably 90%, I'm making a number up, but probably 90% of the work we do on long-term strategic initiatives within trying to shift systems is to try little probes. So examples of probes would be just very small kinds of meetings. What's a thing we can try that will teach us more about the system? So I might go out and I might come up with an idea to want to be shifting. Trying to think of a public health example right now. I might want to shift the way I offer services to trauma-informed services to youth in a school. We are not reaching kids in schools with trauma-informed approaches. So we don't know exactly what's going to work. We've got a few ideas because there's folks out in places like Walla Walla in Washington and other places where they've been working in schools around trauma-informed practice. We don't have enough certainty to want to do a year-long intensive mental health project within the school system, but we might want to try, let's try some peer work. Let's try teaching kids about trauma and how trauma works. Let's try doing workshops with teachers around trauma-informed practice. Let's try little things and see if any of those get a little shift in some of the systems, in some of the dynamics that we're seeing in our system. So if something happens, like for example, classrooms become, kids become more, what we call in trauma-informed world, more regulated in their classrooms, we might want to go, oh, that's cool. What are you doing that we can maybe prototype and try in a bunch of different classes? If the peer counseling stuff doesn't work or the peer knowledge stuff doesn't work, we just drop that and go on and move with something else. So the probing a system helps you to try little experiments that don't cost you much so that when you can drop them quickly and move on to things that are working. It helps you to explore the terrain of what we're doing. All of this is implementation design. So I'm going to pause there and let you just take a breath and ask if there's any questions or anything you have on the implementation work here. Outputs and architecture of implementation.
Chris, are you gonna, I noticed on the other slide prior to this, you have limiting beliefs.
Yeah.
I don't know, I know, we have Caitlin in November that's gonna speak on that. I didn't know if you were gonna speak on that at all, or?
One of the things that we do, I will speak on that in a second because it's this 8th step in the stepping stones. But one of the things we do when we're working with templates like this is we always have a limiting beliefs parking lot. So at any point in this process, you will encounter limiting beliefs. And Caitlin will talk to you a lot more about this next month. But you will encounter these limiting beliefs and you're going to need to deal with them. Because if you don't, you'll build them into your structure. So you'll see templates that we use that have a parking lot for limiting beliefs. And that's because we want to collect them and gather them and work with them as we go, rather than leaving them towards the end. Any other questions about the outputs and implementation?
Chris, I could ask a question.
Yeah.
I know there's a couple folks on the call who are part of NAC, which is the Northern ACEs Collaborative in northern part of California. It's 5 counties coming together for a regional approach. Mm-hmm. And we had done a session, an ideation session, and came up with 3 potential projects. I don't know what we want to call them at that phase, but 3 things that we want to do to create a trauma-informed region. Mm-hmm. So one of them, we're developing an app to support people when they do encounter someone who has experienced trauma, that would support them in how do you actually respond in a trauma-informed way, so an app. The second one was about having rotating regional trainings on ACEs and domestic violence. And then the third one was on messaging and using communication as a tool to create greater levels of education and awareness across the region around ACEs, trauma-informed domestic violence. And so they came up with these 3 different areas, and they are all super interconnected to each other. And so I'm just wondering, you know, what are some potential probes that they could do in order to move towards, you know, the next step?
Well, I mean, think of probes in that sense as being testing phases, right? So anybody developing an app will know, you know, you've got version 0.5 and then you've got version 1. And that's what the difference between a probe and a prototype, really. So you're wanting to, like, what needs to go into an app? I don't know. Let's try some stuff out. Let's see how this works. That first version of the app better not be your final version of the app, right? And that's really what these concentric circles talk about. You need to iterate. So you need to begin to build and see what's working and then build that feature into the app. And as you go, this is why the developmental evaluation swirl here is a spiral. As you develop something, you're going to be evaluating it all the time because you're evaluating it for the purpose of development. The same is true with communication messages. Anybody that's worked in strategic communications will know you test things. You try them out. You go to a Starbucks and you ask somebody, hey, do you understand this? You have a community meeting where you tell the story and see how it responds. Before you like have a billboard campaign, you don't want to just sort of you don't want to sit it. Last thing you want to do is sit around in a room, 4 or 5 of you, come up with a great slogan and throw it up on a billboard, you know, costing tens of thousands of dollars. You want to be evaluating and testing and testing and testing to see what happens over time. And if it's a linear project with some sweet outcomes, you can do a summative evaluation of it. But in general, in trying to affect something like trauma-informed practice or other public health issues, you're going to be doing developmental evaluation, which is, in other words, is what's happening, what does it mean, is it a good or a bad thing, now what do we do? So the so what, now what thing is a key piece of your implementation. You have to get used to iterating, so you're improving things as you go, but also building out the scale. So what this model shows you is the different scales of tests. I call it the 5P model. You move from patterns to probe to prototypes to pilots to programs. And those 5 Ps help you to be able to understand that, I mean, we're going to work at this scale now, and hopefully with improvements, we can go to another scale of stability. Each of these, as you get further and further out, is a scale of stability. So those are examples, you know, like your first versions of the app are going to be your probes. Once you find out something that works, you're going to prototype it, give it to a few people to use. They're going to break it. That's the purpose of prototyping. When they break it, you fix it, and you've got something, you can finally release it and go either to a pilot project or a program itself. Does that help?
Very much. I know there's other folks on the call who may have a question from that. So just see if there's any of those lingering, because they're here on this call. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, so we'll move on just to the last. I know one of you has to leave, but we'll just move on to the last group of stepping stones here. So once you've done, I'm going to show you the final thing here. So once you've gone through these 6 stepping stones from the invitation phase into the implementation phase, finally you go into the structuring phase. And but still, we don't go right to final decisions about structure. What I like to do first is, you know, what we've just been talking about, is to begin with a concept. So we're going to begin conceptualizing what our action responses could be. In this diagram here also shows like levels of conceptualization of things. So the concept is basically when you know what your need and your purpose, your principles and your people are, when you know what outputs you're after creating, and you know how you're going to implement and sustain them. Now you might want to say, okay, how are we going to do this? And the example I use in the Chaordic Stepping Stones book is to say, you know, what different ways can we cross a body of water? You know, we can put a ferry in, we can put a bridge in, we can do, what was the other example that I used? Put a ferry in, put a bridge in, we can put a causeway in. Those are concepts. we don't have to decide exactly how any of those are going to work, but we should kind of like weigh the merits of different ones. Like, is a bridge a good idea? Is a ferry maybe a better idea? What is the best way to cross this body of water, and to keep it at the concept level, not to go into the actual structure level at this point. And the reason for that is because having a concept will trigger your limiting beliefs. And I'll tell you a story. Working in with the Kellogg Foundation for a number of years, a small group of 6 of us, did some work where we took over we didn't take over, we were hired to do their Food and Society Conference, which is a big annual gathering that Kellogg used to sponsor, where they would bring together everybody involved in the good food system to talk about everything. I mean, it was 600 people in the room. It was everyone from academics to farmers market people to, we got messages from Michelle Obama, Michael Pollan. I mean, everybody you've ever heard of that does anything in food was at these conferences. And the feedback constantly from these conferences was, make them more participatory. We don't want to come here and listen to keynote presentations for 4 days. That's not a good use of our network. So they hired us, team of Art of Hosting stewards, 6 of us, to come in and to work over 2 years. We did 2 of their conferences. And we got to the concept stage when we were planning the conferences with a group of 20 participants, many of them young, who had been complaining about the nature of the conferences. So we just put them on the core team to help design the conference. And we came up with some incredible participatory designs I remember in our first meeting. And the youth were like totally into like, okay, let's go, let's structure the conference now this way. And we said, no, let's take these concepts and let's run them by the VP who's responsible for this conference, the VP of Food and Society. And that was truly illuminating. So we took the concepts and we said, here are the concepts for our new conference. It's totally participatory. And then I remember my friend Toka, who Dana knows anyway, looked at the VP and said, what makes you tremble? Because the VP's eyes were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, trying to imagine letting go of all the control that they've had over this conference for years and years and years to make it truly participatory. And he just went on this incredible rant of all of the different ways in which this was a terrible idea. This was never going to work. This was going to drag Kellogg brand down. This is not what we wanted. And so we just recorded all of those limiting beliefs, all those assumptions, all those judgments, and all those fears. And we sat with him and a few others who were senior executives with the power to say no. We sat with them and we just worked through conversing with them. We didn't do the work, but you'll learn that next month from Caitlin. But we worked through with them what these fears were. Some of them were well justified. And so some of them we were able to build into the concepts, right? We wanted to mitigate against people taking over the conference, for example. Okay, that's fine. Some of them we had to make compromises on, like, we need the executive of Kellogg to have a 1-hour presentation time. It's like, that seems like a dumb idea, but okay, we'll put it in there. And it was the lowest rated part of the conference, by the way, afterwards. It was the only time 4 people on the stage, all with the same skin color, all wearing suits, used a PowerPoint presentation. And it was a complete disaster in terms of the evaluation of the conference. But otherwise, we kept pointing to the data. We kept pointing to the need, which was people want a more participatory experience. They're thinking of not coming back if they don't get to connect with the network in a deeper way. And so we could rationalize and justify the things that were in our concept, but we had to deal with and expose the limiting beliefs, because, the maxim that I work with is, if you don't deal with the limiting beliefs, you will build them into the structure, which explains why so many organizations are siloed, why people don't like to talk to each other, why we can create strategic plans where people that hate each other never have to interact. And that's because we don't deal with limiting beliefs. We don't surface them, we don't look at them, we don't deal with them. And it could be because of conflict aversion, it could be because power is running rampant in the system. But for whatever reason, the concept is, starting with a concept before you roll out a spreadsheet and get into structure is a much better idea than going straight to like creating an agenda or creating a project plan for a larger scale initiative. So concept triggers limiting beliefs. There's a little feedback loop there. You improve the concept. Once you've got something that people can live with, then you actually roll out, and it's unbelievable. You roll out an Excel spreadsheet. There's often an audible sigh of relief from certain people in the room who've been waiting for some actual order to finally show up in the process. And then you start, either using project planning methods if it's a straightforward project, or, creating a little, a script and a flow and an agenda for a participatory meeting, or a project plan for how and when we're going to get out there, what we're going to learn, what we're going to do. So it all gets sort of built into a form. And you get to choose your methods. So all of the methods that you're going to be using to engage, whether they're your engagement methods, your evaluation methods, your planning methods, your sense-making methods, they will all be deeply informed by all this work that you've done here, right? The need and the purpose will be in there. They'll contribute to the outputs. The architecture of implementation is ready and waiting for you to produce something so it can be used and put into the next iteration. And that way the structure almost looks after itself. You just need somebody who's good at either project management or participatory engagement work, so that they have exposure to lots of different tools, lots of different ways of working, so that they can meet the needs and the purpose that you've built into your plan. And that, friends, is how the Chaordic stepping stone works in a linear way. Each one of these is a conversation. For large-scale initiatives, as I said, some of these can be over several years. Some of them can be just, if you're planning a staff meeting, I'd still go through the same thing. You can just touch on each one, take a couple of minutes to touch on each one. In the tool that's on my website, there's a whole bunch of questions that you can use. They're all from different contexts, so you might pick and choose questions. And then there's what we call the harvest from each of these. So if you have your concept, if you have your conversation on outputs, for example, you might, you know that what you're going to be harvesting is a sense of the what physical artifacts that will be able to share the results of your work, that kind of thing. So you can get a lot more guidance in the tool. As I say, I use it in a linear way, the way I've taken you through it. I also use it as a way of listening to a client's story about where they're at, and I'll just fill in these buckets, collect stuff and chuck it in these buckets, and it'll help me to see where they're weak, where they haven't been thinking about stuff, or where they've made a bunch of assumptions about things, and then it tells us a good place where we might start our work. So there's the tool. It's a tool, a little bit of form, holds you in a chaotic space, and lets you engage in a participatory way, but also a deliberate way of bringing enough form so that folks know that they're being hosted, and you're producing good planning conversations as you go. Questions, comments? Take a minute.
Yeah, Chris, this is great. I see a comment in here from Diana. This is good information. Thank you. So, thanks, Diana.
I also, go ahead, Sue.
Well, I was just kind of like thinking about the architecture of implementation, and I'm thinking about a couple of the groups that we work with, and I don't know if this will make sense, but it just kind of, I'm thinking about, there's the local groups who can use this, right? But they're part of a bigger, I'm going to use the word system, right? So there's 13 catchy sites in California. So individually, and when I think about the NAC group, right, there's 5 counties and individually, but there's this whole domestic violence ACEs work that's happening. And I'm just thinking a lot about the connections where people really are just thinking at a local level, but there's this bigger picture, right, of like, if you really want things to be impacted, and just scaffolding, or anyway, I just was kind of struck because I've been thinking about that a lot, and where are we all going on this? Like, the individual work is good and it's great. There's also this bigger potential for impact, right? From a policy and systems level. And so just thinking about using that tool with that in mind, I think it just kind of came up for me as you were talking. So
yeah, I mean, these are really questions of sustainability. You're doing all this work. What are you doing to put in place to sustain it? And that's what the architecture of implementation really is. It's really about working with relationships, because relationship contributes to sustainability, but it's also material. It's also very, very tangible, right? Like, what are the accesses? What access do we have to policy making, or to shifting the drivers in the system that are keeping this problem in place? Like, where do you have access to that? And this is one of the issues around trying to work with social determinants of health. Donella Meadows, who wrote her great book on systems thinking and systems change, talks about points to intervene in a system. And she's got a hierarchy of points. And the first 5 are all about power. They're all about the power to change the system. The most powerful one is that you have the power to transcend the existing paradigm. Very few of us have that power to initiate a transcendence of the existing paradigm that creates social determinants of health, that creates issues around the social determinants of health. So, so you need to figure out where you're working at, and you need to figure out if you can align yourselves with somebody that can work with you a little bit higher on that hierarchy, so that you can have the influence. And those are, that's what we call politics sometimes. How do I make alliances with people that have the power I need? That's, and I think that's I think that's what you need to ask yourself. How do we sustain and get a bigger reach for what we're doing?
Yeah.
See a question from Junie, or an insight from Junie. A lot to take in as a therapist to keep thinking about how to scale up the process of identifying an individual might want to change, navigating the ambivalence one feels, and validating fears and concerns about changing. Yeah. I mean, those are not just individual concerns, right? Those are also systemic concerns. And again, it comes down to this idea of, do we even have the capacity to transcend the paradigm that we're locked in sometimes? I'd be cool to see how Junie, if you ever had a chance to just reflect on using these stepping stones, or how they might have informed your therapeutic practice. We just did a big Art of Hosting in Washington State, and here is the workbook for it: Designing and Hosting Conversations for Trauma-Informed Approaches to Resilience. And one of our base assumption on the first page here, I'll show you, got a bunch of stuff on ACEs, but our base assumption is this: that the scales of trauma and resilience are embedded. So trauma works at all these levels, and these are connected levels. So all the way from a system through an organization, team, or a society, to a community, to a family, to an individual. So trauma patterns show up in that way, and so too does resilience. So one of the key things about doing this kind of work, and this is true of work in any complex system, is that if you can find the fractal patterns that influence the system, you can make some shifts there. And so where therapists are working with individuals on trauma-informed practice, trauma is a fractal pattern, right? It exists at every level in the system, and so does resilience, which is, in a really simple way, the antidote. So when you impact an individual, working with individuals is required to shift systemic dynamics, but working at systemic levels is required to shifting individual trauma experiences as well. And we know from the neurosciences and from the use of epigenetics and resilience science that that's true. And so you can make those shifts fairly quickly. There is a great, if you're interested in this stuff, there's a great paper right here. It says, oh, this stuff is like right at hand. This is a brilliant paper. This paper by a psychologist called Unger is, and I'll send you the reference so you can read it. It's called Systemic Resilience Principles and Process for a Science of Change in Contexts of Adversity. So what he has done is he has looked over 7 or 8 different contexts, including biological, psychological, social, cultural, economic, legal, architecture, ecological systems, communication systems. And he's looked at resilience in all of these different kinds of systems to find sort of 7 principles of resilience. So these principles that he says here, for example, resilience occurs in contexts of adversity. So if you want to create resilience, you have to work with adversity. You can't make completely safe spaces for people. You have to make what we call brave spaces, or safe enough spaces, where people can struggle to learn, because you don't get resilient without adversity. Resilience is a process. There are trade-offs between systems when a system experiences resilience. So these are the principles that are in here. They're excellent design principles for designing these kinds of interventions, and they work at that fractal level. So you could use these in different systems, and you can also use them at different levels in the system. We will send references, Junie, don't worry.
And we do have a call with Teresa Posiconi, who was also hosting the training that Chris is referencing, coming up. So we'll ask her to focus in on that. She'll be talking about neuroscience and resilience.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
It's good stuff. Good, because it's the intangible, resilience is one of the intangible outputs, especially when you're doing work in public health and this kind of work that you're working on. In every interaction, you have the opportunity to re-traumatize people, right? Or to contribute to their trauma or to contribute to their healing. And so doing this work, that's why, you know, I'm very serious about the intangible outputs. Doing this work requires us to take trauma-informed approaches because we can create resilience in every interaction. And in doing that, it helps to create a new system and a shift in the systems that will help create more resilient systems as well.
Drop the mic, Chris.
Yeah, that was pretty powerful what you just said. I think it looks like, I don't know, Diana, if that was you, the 530, or if that's Lisa. I don't know if you were getting ready to say something, but yeah.
I wasn't necessarily, this is Diana, I wasn't necessarily going to say something. I agree that was very powerful what you just said. And I appreciate kind of this whole overall presentation that gave a lot of information in an hour and a half, or not even an hour and a half. And I'm glad that we talked about, you know, different ways that we can use it with our larger system of 5 counties. I see a lot of benefits to be able to use it within, from small group meetings to really changing some of the systems that need to be changed to address some of the issues that we're facing today here in California counties. So
Cool. Yeah, I can't wait to follow along as you're doing this stuff. And of course,
Yeah, come on down, Chris.
Yeah, I'd love to. God, let's make a date. Love to come back
That's
to
right.
Northern California and catch up with what's going on there. Yeah, no, it's good work. And I mean, it's happening, and you're not alone in it. Like, it's happening here as well in Canada. I mean, a lot of my work over 30 years has been in Indigenous communities. And so most of the trauma-informed practice that I've been exposed to and learned about is what some would call Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of doing things. So it's about community resilience and community health and wellness, which is decolonization, another word for decolonization, to restore those healthy systems and life-giving systems in communities. And so that stuff's been happening here for quite a long time. And then on the kind of non-Indigenous public health side, in places like Alberta, has a massive trauma-informed practice community and a powerful online program, which Caitlin and I are both gonna be taking. I think Teresa has done it as well, but I'm not sure. But it's like a beautiful introduction to trauma-informed practice that you can take as a self-paced online course. So yeah, so there's lots going on, and Washington State's been just a leader in all of this for quite a while as well. So yeah, lots to learn from Teresa and others. But, you know, basically, you know, I mean, it comes down to, for me, and why these tools matter is these tools are born from the world of participatory work. So, you know, we can't do any of this systemic change work with a small group of people in an oak paneled room, you know, passing laws. That's not how it works. So engaging and building community and building participatory process over time is what shifts the system. And the ways that we manage projects, the linear project management tools that are aloof from relationship, that are aloof from the real spaces where humans are meeting, that simply put everything into a process and press the execute button. That's not how we build resilience. It's not. We need to build these in relational ways. We need to build them with communities. We need to give voices to people that are not experts, which is not to say that we need to decenter experts. It's just about being sensitive to the context. And it's about enlisting people in their own healing and their own community development. And so providing the resources to do that. And those resources include money for sure. They also include time and space, which are resources that folks who are struggling for a living don't also have. Time and space to do things, and time and space to claim their power and to do their work. So that's what these tools are all about. They're all about participatory planning and participatory engagement as you go along. And I hope you get to use them that way.
Chris, I have one question for you. Unless someone else has one.
Nope, not right now.
So, you know, I think what's coming up for me is when you started this conversation, you said, you know, this is a tool that you can use when you don't know what's happening and you don't know the way forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that all of that is great and important, and it's a great guide. And I would say, what are the ways of being that you're entering into the space as a host and a facilitator
Mm-hmm.
in order to navigate that complexity?
Mm. Yeah, in the art of hosting community, we talk about the fourfold practice. So that's very simply. I can't find the slide right now. But the fourfold practice, the art of hosting, what we call the art of hosting, is the answer to that question. It's the way of showing up. And what we talk about in the fourfold practice is these four ways of being. So we could start with like being present. So when you're present to yourself and you host yourself, you transform your, primarily, you can do a lot of things there, but you primarily transform your judgment to curiosity, which means that you enter into a space curious about what the outcome is. If you come into a space as a host knowing what's going to happen, you can't be of service. So the first place is to become present, to host yourself. The limiting beliefs work Caitlin will share with you as my primary method for doing that, Caitlin's as well. When you are present, then you become a good participant. And a good participant means that you know how to participate in dialogue. You can listen, you can tell your own story, you can listen well. That's a capacity that's necessary to participate here. You cannot run a participatory meeting with a group of 300 people listening to you. That's not a participatory meeting. People need to know how to engage, and they know how to need to be in dialogue with each other, and especially learn how to be in dialogue across differences. You need to be able to do that. The third practice of the fourfold practice is to be able to host others. So provide containers in which others can show up and make a contribution. Everybody in a room, everybody in a complex system has a gift, because we don't know what we need until we see it. And if we create processes and we use participatory processes that allow for voices to be actively engaged in creating their own future and understanding what's happening, then we get to benefit from the wisdom all around the room. Diversity and inclusion and equity, it's like, God, our prime minister said it the other day, diversity is a reality, but inclusion is a choice. And I would say that in complexity, inclusion is not a choice, it's mandatory. If you're not doing inclusion work, then you're being an idiot on the complexity side, because you need the intelligence of the margins in order to find your way into new spaces. So hosting others means being able to host everybody together and to be doing it in a way that's inclusive. And when you finally do that, then you get to be able to co-create. That's the fourth practice. Wow, it's very bright. But that's the fourth practice, is co-creation. So co-creation means, you know, getting out of your own damn way, right? It means sort of putting your ego aside and falling in with somebody else and understanding that you can never have the answer. You might have a big piece of it, or you might have a small part of it, but together, the co-creation piece, you know, if we knew what we should do to address trauma in our world, we would do it, but we don't. And so by definition, the answers we're looking for are emergent. And so co-creation is what we need to do. So that's how I would say you need to show up, is that fourfold practice is a very helpful framework for just regulating your own leadership and moving into the world. And there's many others, but that's the one we teach in the art of hosting, you know. Just be mindful, just, and don't be a dick.
And a little deepening into the question again is just, you know, I think having a meditation or mindfulness practice, in ways that you can cultivate that impulse or the conditioned responses that life can give you, and how to navigate it in ways that aren't conditioned, but more in the flow of you know, emergence and what is being presented.
Yeah, this is something Teresa and Caitlin will both tell you as well. But in the trauma-informed world, and Junie will tell you this as well, I think, is that in order to deal with, one of the key capacities for being able to deal with trauma is one's own trauma experience, is to cultivate an awareness. And it's that kind of observer function, so that I can see as I'm regulating myself, I have an awareness of where I'm at, so that I can regulate myself well. And that creating that awareness, having a practice where you create that awareness, is a powerful and important individual need, because all of us in the chaotic space will get triggered. Because most of us have trauma of some kind. And a lot of that trauma relates to not being in control. And so when you're creating processes in which emergence is happening, that will often trigger your own patterns of trauma, the ones you haven't dealt with, obviously. And so being able to self-regulate in those spaces are really, really good. Yeah, wise mind, that's nice. So there's this pattern of like, at the individual level, how do I adopt my awareness, my self-awareness mind? I have a really simple practice I do, which is I just ask myself several times a day, I am aware that I am. And I finish that sentence. I just say that, like, I am aware that I am looking at Dana right now. Like that, but even just saying that brings me into an awareness mindset rather than I'm looking at Dana, which is an identity. Like I'm looking at Dana. So I want to say I'm aware that I'm looking at Dana. And that creates that separation. That's just a good little practice. But because it's fractal, right? It can happen in the individual level and on the collective level. So we need to create spaces where collectives also have an opportunity to observe their own behavior. That's partly what the Chaordic Stepping Stones does. It gives you I wouldn't say it's a therapeutic model, but it gives you a scaffolding, or it gives you a way of stopping doing and starting to look at what you're doing. It slows you down. So in a planning tool, maybe its most powerful effect is that it has you become, as a collective, as a group, it has you become aware of what you're doing, aware of how you're practicing. And that awareness means that you can then do what you would do as an individual with that awareness. So I do believe we need to cultivate collective mindfulness practices,
yep.
As well as individual mindfulness practices to work on things like trauma, which exist through different scales in our systems and benefit from that same approach. Resilience comes from our ability to regulate ourselves by getting an awareness function. And you can just see the way that the political conversation is in the United States right now. It's just a lot of unaware reaction, right? People just, all of us are doing it. All of us are snapping, right? And we're all unregulated and unaware. And so when you can calm down, see what you're doing, regulate your own behavior that way, then that helps you to become more resilient in the face of this massive amount of chaos that's happening right now. So.
Thank you so much, Chris. You are so amazing. So I'm just going to take this next minute to give space for all of us to just appreciate you. So if anybody has either a written appreciation or a verbal appreciation, I feel like I just got a shot or a dose of just feeling uber present and connected and grateful for your own mastery that you bring with you. So thank you so much.
I'm glad it can be of service.
This is Junie, got a jam. But as a brown woman doing this work, just want to thank you for not being a dick, Chris. Thank you.
Hilarious.
High praise for a white guy.
That's hilarious.
Thank you, Chris.
You're so welcome.
Thank you. This was very practical, very helpful.
Yeah, it was great. I want to go back and actually listen to it again. There's quite a few things that I was trying to capture, but very, very good. So thank you.
And this is from Anna Maria. Chris, your generosity, openness, and warmth is so nourishing. Thank you for developing this model and guiding us through emergence and complexity.
You're welcome. Thank you, Anna Maria. And I wanted to say I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, many giants in the art of hosting community that have shaped this Chaordic Stepping Stones model. This is my version of it, but it's a piece of communal property.
Right.
Cool.
Okay,
nice
Chris,
to be with you. Look forward to being with you in person sometime.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Chris. You're amazing.